if you are above the foramen magnum, you are going to be considered medulla oblongata, right? Here's the foramen magnum. And if you are below, you are going to be considered spinal cord. So the top of the spinal cord looks just like the bottom of the foramen magnum. They're pretty much continuous with one another. Now, as far as so that's where it starts. Where it stops is surprising to most people. Most people would think that since you have vertebra all the way down to the lumbar region, right, and then you have the fused sacral vertebra, and you've got a hole running all the way through there, you would think that your spinal cord was as long as that, but it's not. The spinal cord actually ends at about L1 or L2. So if you can feel down to your last ribs, you can feel your last ribs, and then go 2 vertebrae below there, and that's where your spinal cord ends. Spinal cord ends about L1 or L2. Now, I'm not saying there isn't nervous tissue in the hull of the vertebral canal after that, but it's PNS tissue, not CNS tissue, which will matter clinically, because if you had to choose something to damage, even accidentally, sure as hell not going to choose CNS tissue to damage, right? Because you're hosed if you damage CNS tissue. Okay, so it ends about L1 or L2. So that means in most people it averages about 16 to 18 inches. But if you're way taller, it doesn't like end right here, right? Shaquille O'Neal's is just way longer than yours. It's going to go all the way to L1 and L2 in him. Okay, now the other thing about the spinal cord, and I really want to make sure that you guys get to look at the spinal cord when you go to lab next week, if you didn't already, make sure that you look at it, because for all of the importance of the functionality of the spinal cord, it's only about a ½ an inch wide. It's a teeny tiny little structure. It's about a ½ an inch wide, and you will be able to see it. We have a phenomenal, I don't know if you've seen it on this campus, we have a phenomenal spinal cord dissection on this campus. It's a really hard dissection to do. We don't have exactly that dissection on Redwood campus yet, although we do have a good one. And what it is it's this dissection, in which they took a dorsal aspect and they carefully removed the musculature. And by the way, my lab assistants did this. They did it as part of their project. That's one of the cool things that you get to do when you're a lab aide or a lab assistant or TA. So they carefully removed all the musculature on the back. And then in order to see the spinal cord, which part of each vertebra do you have to take off? Think about that. Spinous process and the lamina, right? That whole part. So what they had to do is take all the soft tissue off, and then for every single one of the vertebra, all the way down through the sacrum, they had to pull off the dorsal part of it. So you actually have to break the bone and pull it off, and it's really meticulous work. And then once they got in there, you have the dura mater that would be covering the spinal cord, and then they had to slice open the dura mater and reflect it back so that you could see something that looks like this. The dura mater reflecting the spinal cord. So please make sure that you go look at it. We've got it dissected all the way from the occipital bone all the way down through the sacrum. So you can see the nerves and where it's actually coming out. It's a pretty damn cool dissection. They're in the process, by the way. Another group of lab aides this semester is working on one for the Redwood campus. They're working on that dissection right now. Okay, so now, the spinal cord ends at L1 or L2, but the meninges don't end at L1 or L2. And so remember that the meninges are going to wrap the spinal cord like they wrapped the brain. So you're going to have dura, arachnoid, and then pia. Okay? So if you look at this figure, you can see that, notice here, they're trying to show you that the meninges go all the way down to S1 or S2. Does that make sense? They go all the way down there. Now, what is the clinical relevance of that? The clinical relevance of that, if the arachnoid and the subarachnoid, and therefore the subarachnoid space, go all the way down to S2, if I needed to get at cerebrospinal fluid, I have a less risky way of getting at it, right? So theoretically, I could take it out of the ventricles of the brain, right? But you're going to have to damage some brain tissue going in to get it, right? Or I could take it out of the subarachnoid space around the brain, but I would actually have to go through the skull in order to get it. You guys with me? Or I could take it out of the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord, but then if I would actually hit CNS tissue. So what if I actually want to take it out, but I don't want to run the risk of damaging CNS tissue? Well, I go well below L2, because that's where the spinal cord ends. So between L3 and L4, or L4 and L5. And then I go through the dura mater, right? Into the arachnoid and the subarachnoid space, right? And then I can suck out cerebrospinal fluid. Why would you want to do that? The reason you would want to do that is sometimes the cerebrospinal fluid is the least invasive way to get an idea of what's going on in the CNS. Okay, so I can suck out this fluid. It's called a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. Here's what it looks like right here. you would go between the vertebrae. Usually when they're doing that, by the way, they're going to have you bend over so they get a good spread between your vertebrae. And then they're counting, right? They're counting down to figure out where to go. And then they're going to go through the dura mater into the subarachnoid space. And then they're going to examine the content of the CSF. So for instance, we know approximately how much glucose and oxygen and carbon dioxide and ions should be in there. So you can detect like metabolic abnormalities that way. But also you can detect pathogens, which could either be in the cerebrospinal fluid or your immune system response to pathogen. For instance, I don't know if you guys have learned this yet, if you have a bacterial infection, certain types of white blood cells will increase in proportion. If you have a viral infection, it's a different kind. If you have a multicellular parasite, it will be a different kind, right? So that's your first indication of what's going on, okay? Or sometimes if you have a cancer, a CNS cancer, remember cancer cells really like to get mobilized to go to other regions, and they will go through the CSF, and you can find them sometimes in the CSF as well. So that's called a lumbar puncture or spinal tap. I've heard it hurts like hell. Has anybody had one done? Yeah, oh, wow. The hell, 3 people in one class? It's like the first time ever. So the most common reason I know of, and you guys can share if you want to, but it's your medical history. The most common reason that I know of people getting that done is that they suspect meningitis. Meningitis, which is irritation or inflammation of the meninges, which could be viral or bacterial, right? And the bacterial one is highly communicable from person to person, but it's treatable with antibiotics, right? So you need to know whether it's viral or bacterial. The viral portion is less communicable, but there's no cure for viruses. So you just have to like keep the person alive as they go through the viral life cycle and keep the inflammation down. So have you guys heard of like whole schools shutting down because of meningitis scares? Yeah, because it causes irritation or inflammation of the meninges all the way around the brain and the spinal cord. Paralysis is a possibility. Brain damage and death are possibilities. Like, it is not something that people mess around with. So, and it's communicable. So if one kid in the school had it, like everybody goes home, right? And if you had a close access, then a lot of times they'll do a spinal tap to make sure that one of the things that can happen with a spinal tap, I don't know if it happened with any of the 3 of you, is that the hole doesn't seal very well, and you start leaking cerebrospinal fluid during the healing process. Worst headaches ever. And sometimes they have to go in and do a little patch to like help it heal over. So anyway, that is a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. Go ahead.
So it goes through the dura mater and...
Dura mater and what do you have to go into to get into the subarachnoid space? Arachnoid, exactly. Dura mater and arachnoid. Okay, so briefly, let's talk about your spinal nerves for a second, and we will talk about these in more detail later. Okay, so spinal cord is obvious. That's CNS tissue, right? Spinal nerves are PNS tissue, yes? Now, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, but you need to understand how they're named just generally and where they come off. So they're going to go out between two vertebrae, right? They're going to go out in the space between the vertebra, the intervertebral foramen. So right there is the intervertebral foramen where they would go off. And there are 31 pairs, and they are labeled roughly for where they come out. No, they are not labeled for where they come off of the spinal cord, because then you wouldn't have any down here, right? Okay, they're labeled for where they exit the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Okay, so before we go any further, how many cervical vertebrae do you have? Cervical, 7. How many thoracic? 12. How many lumbar? 5. Sacral? Yeah, it's variable. Sacral is usually 5, and coccygeal anywhere between 1, 3, 5, So they're labeled roughly for where they come out, and they're usually labeled for the vertebra above them. But, just a second, but this one right here comes out between the first vertebra and the occipital bone. So you end up with 1 extra cervical spinal nerve. That makes sense? So you got C1 through C8. What was your question?
So there's 8 nerves, but
yes, 7 vertebra. Because the first one comes out before the vertebra, right? So you end up with 1 extra cervical spinal nerve. So you call them cervical spinal nerves, and they are labeled C1 through C8. Okay, go ahead.
And is there an extra T and L?
I'll talk about those. Let me get down there. So the T1 through T12 go normal, right? They are labeled for the vertebra above them, right? So I've got T1 through T12. Those are called your thoracic spinal nerves. Everybody okay with that? L1 through L5, lumbar spinal nerves. The numbers are good. And the numbers stay good until you get down to coccygeal. S1 through S5 is your sacral spinal nerves. And then we have only one, coccygeal spinal nerve. And C1 was taken, right? Yeah? So this is called C01, the little sub-zero, C01. So that's what that one is. Okay, so those are how they're labeled. And we'll talk about their functionality a little bit later when we get to the plexuses. Good? Okay. It's not super hard because they don't have any other names. They don't have like vestibulocochlear or hypoglossal or any of that business. They've just got their numbers. Okay, and we're going to come back to those when we talk about their functionality a little bit later. Okay, so first, let's concentrate on the spinal cord and let's look at the general structure of the spinal cord. So spinal cord is from cervical region to about L1 or L2, right? Okay, so I'm going to ask you conceptually a couple of questions. First off, please note that the cervical region of the spinal cord is in purple here, and then the thoracic is in orange, and then the lumbar is in blue right here. Okay, so conceptually, which of those regions, the cervical, the thoracic, or the lumbar, is going to have the most information coming to and from it? What do you think? It's the cervical. And I don't know if you remember this or if you've even studied it yet, but remember that generally the information from here goes to here and here goes to here. But there's not much left to innervate here because I don't know if you guys remember or studied, but the vagus nerve, which is a cranial nerve, does most of the innervation of the stuff in the ventral body cavity. So that's all taken care of by a cranial nerve, right? So now there's really not much to control here. There's like intercostal muscles and sensation that's going on right here, which isn't a whole hell of a lot of innervation, really. So the cervical region has the stuff going to and from your arms, right? And then the thoracic region doesn't have much comparatively. And then the lumbar region has what? Legs, exactly. So for that reason, although this picture is drawn poorly, you can see it on the actual specimen. The cervical region is slightly plumper, and then the thoracic region gets skinnier, and then the lumbar region gets plump again. So it's called the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. That make sense? Okay, cervical and lumbar enlargement. They just didn't draw it very well here, so it's not really indicated in the figure. Okay, so when you get to the bottom of the spinal cord proper, the bottom of the CNS tissue, it's about L1 or L2. And that is called the conus medullaris, and it literally means cone in the middle, right? It's a cone in the medulla or the middle. So the conus medullaris, and you can see it right here. Okay, so let's look. So what you're seeing right here is the spinal cord proper has pia mater on it still, and these little blood vessels are kind of stuck under the pia mater, so you can see where it ends, right? Because the blood vessels are stuck on the pia mater. So this little pointy area right there is the conus medullaris. That's the end of the spinal cord proper. I would recommend that when you look at the actual specimen that you touch it because you can feel when the spinal cord ends because it's like a big chunk of tissue. And then what's coming off of the side is not CNS tissue, it's actually PNS tissue. It's actually a whole bunch of nerves that are running just off the side. So this PNS tissue that is running sort of beside and around and distal to the spinal cord is called collectively the cauda equina. Cauda equina means horsetail because somebody thought it looked like a horse's tail. And you can see it there and you can see it here as well. See that cauda equina? It's still running in the vertebral foramen inside the hole, but it's PNS tissue, not CNS tissue. Okay, and one last thing that you can find. This stuff is all really easy to see on a specimen, and that is, do you see this structure right here that's a slightly different color and texture than the structures around it? Do you see that? What that is, that's not nervous tissue. That's actually connective tissue that's attached to the conus medullaris, the end of the spinal cord, and it's wrapped in pia mater, and it goes down and it straps the end of the spinal cord to the bone. So it's actually positioning and holding it. And that is called the filum terminale, which means last hair. So the filum terminale is within the cauda equina, but it's actually not made of nervous tissue. Okay, so you should go find all of those things next week. And next week's lab is over this stuff, by the way. Everybody good? Okay, so that's all sort of the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. And then the thing that we have to do next is we have to look at the spinal cord in cross-section. So we're going to take a chunk of the spinal cord and do a cross-section of it and look at what we find when we do that. Now, first thing is that you have to always be able to orient when you're looking at the spinal cord in cross-section. You have to be able to tell when you're looking at anterior, posterior, dorsal, ventral, which is really easy, of course, if there's a vertebra around it, right? Because everybody knows that the spinous process is what? Is posterior, right? But there isn't always a vertebra around it. So you need to have a second and a third way to confirm whether you're looking at anterior or posterior. So you can do it any way you want, but I'll tell you a couple of dependable ways, okay? First off, do you know what a swallowtail butterfly looks like? The one with the round top wings and then the pointy bottom ones? Have you seen those? Okay. So the gray matter in the middle of the spinal cord looks kind of like a swallowtail butterfly to me. And the round top wings are always going to be anterior, right? And the pointy bottom wings are always going to be posterior, okay? So the shape of the gray matter changes a little bit as you go from cervical to thoracic to lumbar region, but this is pretty dependable. So I want you to look at these next couple pictures and tell me if you can look at the shape of the gray matter and figure out what's anterior and posterior. So this one's obvious, but again, you can confirm it by saying, well, it looks like this should be posterior, and then you find the spinous process, and you're like, apparently I'm right. But what about this one? Can you tell what's anterior or posterior here? Right, so that's posterior, and then the anterior's on the front. How about this one? Yeah, anterior's on the front. Now, they're not always going to be drawn that way, so you have to be able to figure out what you're looking. You've got some cross-sectional models in lab, and you will get all the structures on the spinal cord wrong unless you can figure out anterior from posterior, because most of them are labeled dorsal or ventral or anterior or posterior or something. So, and then there is one other way that I like to do it, and the other way to do it is that on one of these are called the roots of the spinal cord, and they're going to lead to nerves. One of them has a lump on it, and it's called the dorsal root ganglion, and the other one never does, okay? So does that confirm for you what you thought, that this is dorsal or posterior? Yeah, because that's the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion, right? How about here? Do you see the dorsal root ganglion still confirms what you thought? How about this one? Dorsal root ganglion. That's what I use. You can use whatever you want to locate it, and then make sure that you can figure out in any figure, either use one or more of those to figure out what the heck you're looking at. So can you look at this one and tell what's anterior and posterior? So anterior is that way and right, exactly, right? Okay, so just get to the point that you can quickly like orient yourself and figure out how that goes in there. And then the rest of the cross-section of the spinal cord is pretty easy after you've got anterior and posterior down. So let's start looking at the functionality. Okay, as far as the basic functionality, and then we'll look at the specific anatomy. So I'm going to give you a big picture understanding of what goes on in the spinal cord, and then we'll add some details as we go along. The spinal cord has two sets of roots, right? It's got this one, and it's got this one. Eventually, they're going to come together. Okay, so here's a big picture of what the spinal cord does. What the spinal cord does is, I want you to imagine me putting my hand on a hot stove. Only this time I'm not going to have a voluntary response involving my cerebral cortex. I'm going to have a reflex, right? And the reflex you don't really think about, and they're really, really fast. They're so fast because sometimes they go straight through your spinal cord and back out. And we'll reinforce that in just a second. So what's going to happen is, hand on a hot stove, the sensory information is going to come into the cervical region of my spinal cord, right, because it's arm, right? And it's going to come in the back side of my spinal cord, in the dorsal side. That's where sensory information comes in, right? And then it's going to get processed in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Everybody with me? And then the motor information is going to go out the ventral side, right? So it's going to go in, out, move. Good? Okay, so that's how spinal cord works. Generally speaking, the posterior or dorsal half of your spinal cord is sensation, and the anterior half is motor activity. The only thing that I like about that is that it corresponds with what we learned about the brain, right? Does that make sense? So in the back side, out the front side when you're doing sensory and motor activity. I don't think that has anything to do with that, but it just, works that way. Okay, so the ventral root never has a ganglion on it, never. So let's start talking about the cross-section and the structure-function relationship. So if you do a cross-section of the spinal cord, you can see that the general pattern is white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside, right? okay? So it's a simpler anatomy, of course, than the brain. So let's look at the basic anatomy. So the white matter has names depending on where it is, and so does the gray matter. Okay, so we're just going to look at the cross section. So as long as we've got anterior and posterior correct, this is okay, because these anterior portions right here are called anterior white columns, because isn't that what they would be, like white columns going up? Now, your textbook likes this word, funiculus, but nobody else uses that word. So they are either called the anterior funiculi or the anterior white columns. I'm pretty sure I know which one I would prefer if I were you. And then these guys back here are the posterior white columns. And then these guys over here are the lateral white columns. Now, to reinforce what we did last time, what kinds of tracts do you think that the spinal cord is primarily composed of? Yeah, it's mostly projection. It's not exclusively projection, because there is a little bit of left to right communication, but it's mostly projection tracts, yes? So if you did a cross section, you would see mostly fibers going up and down there. Okay, so you've got your anterior white columns, your posterior white columns, and then your lateral white columns. And then in addition, we have this little part that's neither anterior, posterior, or lateral. It's kind of in the middle, and that's called the white commissure. It's just like connecting the halves, right, like we talked about. Okay, and then let's look at the gray matter. The gray matter in there is again labeled for where it is, anterior, posterior, or lateral, but they're called horns. So you've got anterior gray horns, posterior gray horns, and then some little bitty lateral ones. So anterior gray horns, yeah? Posterior gray horns. And then the lateral ones, in some regions of the spinal cord, they're really pronounced and sometimes they're not. But do you see the suggestion of a little lump laterally right there? That's the lateral gray horn, okay? So now, that's all really easy. But then we're going to put together some structure and function relationships. Oh, by the way, one more thing. Here's the central canal of the spinal cord. It's in the middle of this gray chunk connecting the two halves called the gray commissure. And I know that we don't usually use the word commissure or commissural with gray matter, but this one's just sort of an exception. And the central canal of the spinal cord should have what in it? What's going to be? Yeah, it's got cerebrospinal fluid, right? That was made up in the brain and is circulating down there. Everybody good with that? Okay, so now what I want to do is put together this structure function with a simple reflex, and watch a simple reflex go through the spinal cord. Is that okay? So here is what we're going to do. We're going to look at this figure. Okay, and what I should find in the gray matter of the spinal cord is neuron cell bodies, right? That's what I should find there. Okay, and I shouldn't find any neuron cell bodies to speak of in the white matter of the spinal cord. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a very, very simple reflex, and a reflex is totally different than a voluntary activity. A voluntary activity is using your cerebral cortex to decide consciously what should be going on, right? But a reflex is simpler and faster than that. So what I want you to imagine is, instead of putting my hand on a hot stove and thinking I need to move my hand, the sensory experience is so profound that I immediately respond without even thinking about it. With this particular instance, what they're doing is they're poking someone with a pin, and they're going to elicit a muscular response because of it. Okay? And by the way, this even works when you're sleeping, and it even works if you're unconscious, just so you know. So it doesn't involve cerebral cortex function. So don't go poking your people while they're sleeping, but trust that it does work. Unless, of course, they agreed to it when they were awake, right? Okay? No, still, they're not conscious. You probably shouldn't do anything to people when they're not conscious. Okay, so here's the skin, okay? I'm going to poke the skin, and here's what I'm going to do. Pretend that I'm like poking it somewhere in the arm, I don't know where. Poking the skin, and the information's going to go up the nerve, and it's going to go in the cervical region of the spinal cord because I'm doing arm, right? And then what it's going to do is, this time I'm not sending it up to my cerebral cortex to actually decide what to do. I'm going to have an immediate response to it. It's going to be really quick, and it's going to be really simple. So this neuron is going to find its cell body in this lump, okay? And that lump is called the what? Dorsal root ganglion. And remember that a ganglion has collections of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, so that is consistent with what you learned, okay? This neuron is going to be specifically a sensory neuron, but it'd be even more specific than that. What kind of sensory neuron is that? That's a somatic sensory neuron because it's carrying information from the skin, yeah? So that's a somatic sensory neuron. And one more question, then we'll move on. Can you look at this neuron and tell me what structural category it is? Not multipolar. That's a unipolar neuron. That's a unipolar neuron right there. Okay, do you see it? Okay, so this unipolar neuron has its neuron cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and then the rest of its axon and dendrite actually goes through the dorsal root. Okay, now all I've done is carried the information to the gray matter of the brain, and I'm going to form a synapse with this neuron. This neuron is not attached to a receptor, and it's not attached to an effector. It is between two neurons, so what is that one considered? That's an interneuron, exactly. And notice that it's in the right place. It's in the gray matter, yes? So here's what this interneuron does. It's basically an off versus on, right? It like decides to continue with the process or to not continue with the process. But it's not complex thought, is it? It's a single neuron just doing yay or nay, right? It's going to continue with the process or not continue with the process. Just so you know, the simplest reflexes don't even need an interneuron in the middle because they always reply to a sensory input with the same motor output. And if you always do that, do you need a decision maker in the middle? You don't need a decision maker in the middle. So I'll show you that reflex. So the simplest reflex is like your patellar reflex. And you guys know the patellar reflex, right? So with the patellar reflex, the sensory information is going to come in. It's going to go through the lumbar region of my spinal cord, right? And then I am always going to respond with the same motor output, right? So let's see if I can do it. So that's always the same. I don't really need to ask a question. I don't even need an interneuron in there. That make sense? Okay, so if I have an interneuron, and I do in this one, then I am going to, let's say I'm going to continue the process, and I'm going to send the motor information out. And we'll fill in the blanks in just a second. So I'm going to send the motor information out. Notice I'm going to find that neuron cell body still in the gray matter. And then the axon of that motor neuron is going to go out what route? Ventral or anterior. Some textbooks use anterior and posterior. I'm in the habit of using dorsal and ventral. The anterior root, and then it's going to go all the way out to the effector. Since this effector is skeletal muscle, you can tell me more about this motor neuron. What kind of motor neuron is it? That's a somatic motor neuron. Good? Okay, so let's go back to your notes and make sure that we can fill in the blanks right here. So this thing that we have been describing is called a reflex arc because it's going in an arc to generate a reflex, right? So what you are going to need as the parts of the reflex arc is you're going to need the sensory receptor, right? And then you're going to need the sensory neuron. Yeah, that's the sensory neuron. And the cell body of the sensory neuron is on the blank ganglion, dorsal root ganglion. The axon or nerve fiber of the sensory neuron runs through the which root? No, this right here, that's still the dorsal root. We're not at interneuron yet because we haven't gotten in there yet. Okay, so the interneuron may or may not be present, but if it is, it's going to be in the gray matter, yes? Okay, and then the motor neuron cell body is going to be, does it make sense to you that it should be in the ventral gray horn? Yeah, the ventral part is doing motor activity, and then the axon of that motor neuron is going to run through which root? That's the ventral root, exactly, and it's going to go all the way out to the effector. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so the flow of information in a spinal reflex is very fast, but it's really not conscious. So the question comes now, if somebody pokes me with a pin and I have a reflex, why am I aware of it if it's not actually being decided upon in my cerebral cortex? It's because what happens in a situation like that is that you poke the pin and the information goes through really quickly and you have the reflex to it. But what you do is you send information up your spinal cord to your cerebral cortex, but not to involve it in the decision-making process. You just tell it what you just did, right? It's like you want to borrow the car, right? But you think your parents are going to say no, so you borrow the car, and then you bring the keys back, and you say, I borrowed the car. Right? You ask for forgiveness instead of permission, right? So you make the cerebral cortex aware of what you just did, but you didn't ask permission for any of it, and you didn't involve it in the decision-making process. So you're generally going to become aware of when something pokes you or burns you or whatever, but you're not always going to involve your cerebral cortex in the process. Now, why? because your cerebral cortex is actually kind of slow. Like compared to a reflex, it involves a whole bunch of synapses and a whole bunch of neurons processing this information. And reflexes are much, much faster than that. Okay, that makes sense? And they're sort of like protective and life-sustaining. Okay, so the next thing we will do is spinal nerves and branches, so we will stop there, and then I will pick up there next time.